The sun was just beginning its slow descent over Crestview Estates, painting the manicured lawns and marble facades of the multi-million-dollar mansions in gold. At the entrance of Bernard Lockridge's sprawling property, a black SUV idled in the circular driveway, its driver waiting nervously while Malcolm Reed, the gatekeeper, methodically checked the credentials of every guest. The air shimmered with the scent of expensive perfumes, freshly mown grass, and a subtle undertone of tension that only the presence of Bernard Lockridge could create. Malcolm's eyes, sharp behind thick-rimmed glasses, scanned the list again. His hand, steady and unflinching, gestured politely but firmly. "I'm sorry, sir, but your name isn't on the guest list. I can't let you in without confirmation." The man's smile faltered. His expensive watch caught the sunlight, glinting almost arrogantly, but Malcolm didn't flinch. This was his domain. Rules weren't suggestions here. They were boundaries that kept the chaos of entitlement at bay. And that's when Bernard Lockridge appeared. Not with a car, not with security, but walking down the marble path like a king surveying his subjects, every eye turning toward him. Bernard's tailored suit looked like it had been stitched by perfection itself, his cufflinks glinting with the power his name carried in the world beyond Crestview. "You work for me," Bernard barked as he reached the gate. His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "When I say let someone in, you let them in." Malcolm didn't flinch. His stance remained calm, measured. "Sir, my responsibility is to ensure the safety of this community. That includes following the gate protocols. No exceptions." Bernard's face flushed red, not just with anger but with disbelief. You think you can talk back to me? Rules don't apply to people like me. You're not in charge here." Malcolm's eyes met Bernard's, steady and unwavering. "Sir, my job is not about who's in charge. It's about fairness. Everyone must follow the rules, even you." The tension between them crackled like electricity. Bernard stepped closer, his shadow stretching long over Malcolm, but Malcolm didn't retreat. Around them, the sounds of a community preparing for the annual Crestview Gala floated. The clinking of crystal glasses, the hum of valet engines, the laughter of guests who believed this would be just another night of indulgence. Bernard's lips curled into a sneer. "I'll make this simple then. Consider this your final warning." He waved a hand, calling attention to the crowd forming behind him. Guests, neighbors, and even some staff looked on with discomfort, sensing the brewing storm. Bernard's power was absolute here, or at least he thought it was. Later that evening, the gala was in full swing. Crystal chandeliers glittered, orchestras played subtle jazz, and waiters navigated the crowd with trays of champagne. Bernard had made sure everything reflected his dominance. The sprawling pool lit with underwater LEDs, a bar staffed with the best mixologists, tables lined with imported caviar, and the estate's gardens designed to impress even the most jaded of socialites. And there, at the center of it all, stood Malcolm Reed, called inside by Bernard himself. Bernard had sent a message to him earlier. "Let's clear the air." It sounded like a peace offering, but Malcolm, having lived through decades of entitlement and arrogance, sensed the trap. When Malcolm stepped onto the estate, he felt the music vibrate through the marble floors. Guests moved aside with curious glances as Bernard guided him through the throngs, his smirk widening with each step. Finally, they arrived at the pool. The water shimmered like liquid sapphire under the estate lights, reflecting the faces of intrigued onlookers. Bernard stopped and turned to face Malcolm fully, placing one hand on his hip as though he were orchestrating a performance. "You think you're in charge at that gate," Bernard said, voice dripping with mockery. "But look at you now, out of place under my roof." Malcolm kept his composure. His hands stayed at his sides. "I'm still following the rules, sir." "Rules," Bernard's laugh was sharp and cutting. "Rules are for those who don't have money. Watch carefully, everyone." Before Malcolm could respond, before any warning could escape his lips, Bernard shoved him. The push was strong, deliberate, and calculated to humiliate. Malcolm stumbled, arms flailing, and plunged into the pool. The water swallowed him with a splash that echoed across the courtyard, and the collective gasp of the crowd punctuated the moment. Phones came out immediately. People were recording, laughing, whispering. Malcolm surfaced quickly, coughing, his hair plastered to his forehead, his expensive suit soaked and clinging. But he was unharmed. He had trained for moments like this. Bernard, on the other hand, laughed. He stepped back, smug, triumphant, a king crowning himself in front of his court. But in that instant, something subtle shifted. The laughter around him carried a hint of discomfort, an unease that Bernard had never felt before. Some guests whispered to one another. Phones were already sending images to the outside world. Bernard's power felt absolute, but only until reality started to chip away at it. Malcolm climbed out of the pool slowly, water dripping, chest rising and falling. He gave Bernard a look not of fear but of quiet resolve. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but carrying. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And just like that, the story had begun to turn. A single act of arrogance, a moment of public humiliation, had planted the first seed of Bernard's downfall. The crowd didn't know it yet, but Malcolm Reed wasn't just a gatekeeper. He was a man who had seen injustice and was about to reclaim it, step by step. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. I worked hard to craft this one for you, and your support helps me keep telling them. Before we continue, what would you do if this happened in front of you? Crestview Estates was the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Wide streets lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, houses that rose like marble fortresses, and lawns so manicured that any imperfection seemed an insult to the entire neighborhood. But beneath the beauty, beneath the glimmering gates and fountains, ran a current few ever acknowledged, the current of power, influence, and entitlement. Money wasn't just wealth here. It was authority, privilege, and the invisible leash that kept people in line. At the heart of it all was Bernard Lockridge. A man who had clawed his way from modest beginnings, Bernard had a story of ambition wrapped in ruthlessness. He remembered the nights in a cramped apartment, watching wealth pass him by while others succeeded. He told himself that he would never be powerless again, and over decades, he had turned that determination into a lifestyle that intimidated even the most hardened businessmen. But for all his accomplishments, Bernard carried an unshakable belief that his wealth absolved him from consequence. That belief had become dangerous. The Lockridge estate reflected that philosophy in every inch. Marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting. Gold-plated faucets gleamed in bathrooms that felt more like galleries than utility spaces. An infinity pool curled around the mansion, more a private lake than a swimming facility, its edge lined with ambient lights. The estate had its own security team, a fleet of exotic cars, and staff trained to anticipate Bernard's every whim. To outsiders, it was perfection. To those who knew Bernard, it was a gilded cage of control, entitlement, and intimidation. And yet, at the gate stood Malcolm Reed, a single man, 52 years old, with a history of service that earned him respect far beyond the walls of Crestview. He had seen arrogance and wealth misused countless times. He had watched people who believed their checks were more powerful than ethics, who thought influence erased rules. Malcolm had learned patience and moral clarity in an unforgiving world, where patience wasn't weakness but a weapon. Malcolm's past was far from glamorous. Born in a working-class neighborhood on the wrong side of the tracks, he had learned early that fairness wasn't automatic. He had lost friends and family to systems that valued money over integrity. His father had died when Malcolm was 15, leaving him to support his younger siblings. He'd held dozens of jobs: janitor, delivery driver, night security, learning every lesson the world could teach about resilience, empathy, and the quiet power of doing what's right. But Malcolm had also faced injustice firsthand. He remembered the first encounter with someone like Bernard, a local business owner who believed rules didn't apply to him. Malcolm had tried to stand up, enforce fairness, and had been humiliated, threatened, and dismissed. That day had left a wound he carried carefully when he refused to let fester into cynicism. That wound was the fuel for his insistence that everyone, even billionaires, follow the rules. On the day of the gala, that insistence collided head-on with Bernard's ego. Bernard's influence ran through the veins of the community: donations to the HOA, sponsorships for local projects, and connections that could ruin careers before breakfast. One subtle call from Bernard could make someone disappear professionally. Malcolm knew this, and yet he stood firm. His moral compass outweighed the risk, at least for now. Yet the pressure Bernard exerted wasn't just psychological. It was structural. Malcolm felt it in the whispers among staff, in the subtle gestures of compliance from neighbors, and in the digital shadow Bernard cast over the estate. Social media accounts, private clubs, charitable boards, all carefully curated to enhance his reputation while masking his aggressive tendencies. Bernard's reach extended beyond Crestview, into the corridors of power where few dared to confront him. Malcolm's life outside the gate was quieter, though not without challenges. His modest home was a contrast to the opulence he guarded against every day. A small garden, a few well-tended shrubs, and the hum of a street alive with ordinary life. He had family, friends who knew his principles, and a reputation for unwavering integrity. But every day, he faced a constant test: how to balance justice with survival in a world that rewarded ruthlessness over honesty. Malcolm thought of the first time he had confronted Bernard. It wasn't a simple interaction. It had been a series of small but significant clashes over months. A delayed guest, a double-booked event, a violation of HOA rules. Each time, Bernard had tested boundaries, seeing if his wealth could bend ethics. And each time, Malcolm had held firm. Those encounters had forged a tension neither man could ignore. Bernard saw Malcolm as an obstacle, a minor annoyance, but Malcolm understood that the stakes were higher than individual frustration. They were about the principle of accountability. That afternoon, as he prepared for the gala, Malcolm reflected on the long hours he had spent ensuring order at the gates. Every detail mattered: verifying guest lists, checking invitations, noticing anomalies in parking permits. He had learned that power wasn't only what one wielded, it was how one chose to act in moments of choice. Bernard wielded wealth and influence with abandon. Malcolm wielded fairness with precision. The gala itself was a study in opulence and tension. Bernard moved among the crowd with the practiced ease of a man used to attention. Socialites laughed at his jokes, staff scurried to anticipate his demands, and the media had been invited to capture the spectacle. Yet there were cracks in the illusion. Guests whispered about Bernard's arrogance at the pool earlier, murmuring about the moment Malcolm had been shoved. Phones were out, cameras recording. Within minutes, the scene was immortalized in snapshots, some sympathetic to Bernard's tantrum, others marveling at Malcolm's composure. Malcolm watched quietly. He was aware that one misstep could cost him his job, his reputation, even his safety. But he also knew something crucial. Bernard's arrogance had created a vulnerability. Public perception could shift, allies could appear, and even the most powerful man could stumble when his own hubris blinded him. The turning point for Malcolm, however, was not just the public incident. It was the realization that his past, every hardship, every lesson in patience and ethics, was not a liability but a weapon. Bernard had underestimated him. He had assumed that age, modesty, and discretion were weaknesses. Malcolm now understood that they were advantages. He could act strategically, quietly, and with precision. But strategy required risk. To reclaim fairness, to expose corruption, to right what had been wronged, Malcolm had to consider moves that could put him in the crosshairs of someone far more powerful. There were no guarantees, no safety nets. Every choice carried consequences, but Malcolm also understood that inaction was unacceptable. He recalled the faces of his siblings, long since grown but forever reminders of the life he had fought to preserve. He remembered mentors who had taught him that justice was not a privilege for the powerful, but a responsibility for those with courage. And he thought of the countless moments he had seen people bend, bow, or break under pressure. Not this time. Not again. By the end of that evening, Malcolm faced a dilemma that could not be ignored. Should he continue to maintain his position, enforcing fairness quietly, or should he take decisive action, leveraging what little he had against a man who had spent a lifetime accumulating influence? He knew the answer even as he stood at the edge of the mansion's driveway, watching Bernard entertain guests with laughter that concealed entitlement, cruelty, and a sense of invincibility. The choice was dangerous. It was uncertain, but it was necessary. Malcolm's mind worked like a silent chessboard, mapping possibilities, weighing risk, and considering allies. He remembered every small detail from previous encounters: the slips of the tongue, the moments of overconfidence, the subtle cracks in Bernard's persona. Those details were not accidents. They were clues, waiting to be turned into leverage. And so, standing there in the shadow of wealth, Malcolm made the decision that would define the coming months. He would act. But he would do it methodically, carefully, and in a way that Bernard would never see coming. The days following the gala were suffused with tension. Bernard Lockridge's arrogance had been caught on film, but the narrative he spun publicly was one of jest, a simple misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a few overzealous guests. Social media had taken the footage, of course, but Bernard's team of image consultants moved quickly, planting interviews, pushing his version of events, and suppressing any content that cast him in a negative light. To most, the incident was a momentary blip, a laughing matter. To Malcolm Reed, it was the opening he had been waiting for, but first, he had to navigate the labyrinth Bernard had built around himself. Malcolm returned to his duties at the gate, outwardly calm, inwardly aware that he was being watched more closely than ever. Bernard had begun to scrutinize his every move. Staff whispered about the black gatekeeper who wouldn't bow, and the HOA received veiled complaints questioning Malcolm's competence. Suddenly, minor infractions were scrutinized as major failings. One guest who had arrived without the correct documentation was now framed as a security breach, and Malcolm's handling of it became a talking point in Bernard's private meetings. But Bernard did not stop at social manipulation. He was meticulous in leveraging institutional power, pulling in legal threats, threatening to sue the HOA for negligence unless Malcolm's authority was curtailed. He contacted local officials and donors, weaving a web designed to isolate Malcolm. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed. Malcolm felt the weight of it. His world, once structured and predictable, now felt like a trap. He had never faced a man who combined wealth, connections, and vindictiveness with such precision. Every day at the gate became a test of nerve. Guests and staff alike watched him, their eyes carrying both doubt and curiosity. It was the kind of scrutiny that could make even the most resilient man falter. Yet Malcolm's resolve remained intact, forged in years of hardship. He thought back to the early mornings delivering packages in pouring rain, the long nights guarding empty warehouses, the small victories that had allowed him to support his family and maintain his integrity. Those memories were both a comfort and a reminder. He was no stranger to pressure. But even the strongest resolve can be tested, and Bernard knew exactly where to apply the pressure. One evening, Bernard escalated. He summoned Malcolm under the guise of discussion, promising a chance to smooth things over. But when Malcolm arrived, it became clear that the meeting was a performance, a public demonstration meant to humiliate him further. Bernard's staff recorded the encounter, capturing Malcolm's every reaction. The cameras, subtle but omnipresent, ensured that even if Malcolm spoke truth, it could be twisted. Bernard's manipulation was precise. He weaponized perception against reality. Malcolm left that meeting feeling the weight of isolation. Friends and colleagues were wary. No one wanted to be caught on Bernard's radar. The HOA board was hesitant to act, worried about reprisals or the loss of funding. Malcolm's principle had put him at odds with an entire system structured to reward wealth and power, and suddenly he faced a profound realization: he was alone. It was at this moment, standing in his modest home, that Malcolm hit his lowest point. He thought about surrendering, about accepting the subtle demotion and retreating into safety. He remembered the life he had built for himself, modest, secure, and predictable. Yet the incident at the pool haunted him. Bernard's arrogance had created a wound in the moral fabric of Crestview, and Malcolm felt an obligation that extended beyond his own pride. To let Bernard walk unchallenged would be to betray everything he had ever stood for. As he sat alone, Malcolm began to review the situation methodically. He needed leverage. He needed allies. And he needed a plan that would not only defend him, but also expose Bernard's abuses to a public that could no longer ignore them. The first breakthrough came when he noticed the inconsistencies in Bernard's documentation. Guest lists, HOA communications, and event permits, everything had been meticulously maintained by Bernard's team. But perfection, Malcolm realized, was often a mask for error. A small detail caught his eye: a set of invoices for entertainment and security expenses that didn't align with the official HOA records. Something as minor as a discrepancy in dates and amounts was enough to hint at financial mismanagement. From there, Malcolm began to map Bernard's network. He discovered that Bernard relied heavily on a small circle of enablers: accountants willing to bend rules, staff fearful of reprisal, and a public relations team whose loyalty was tied to his paycheck. Each connection represented both a vulnerability and a risk. If one could be persuaded or exposed, the carefully maintained facade could crumble. Malcolm also revisited the gala footage. He realized that the initial videos circulating had been selectively edited. Full-length recordings from private security cameras, which Bernard had overlooked, captured nuances, whispered conversations, offhand admissions, and moments of arrogance that could not be denied. Malcolm compiled everything discreetly, knowing that the evidence had to be undeniable. But gathering evidence was only part of the strategy. Malcolm needed an ally, someone with credibility outside Bernard's sphere. That ally came in the form of a local investigative journalist, a woman named Evelyn Tran. Malcolm had met her years ago during a minor HOA investigation. Her integrity was unassailable, and she had a reputation for exposing corruption in affluent communities. After careful consideration, Malcolm reached out, sharing a fraction of the evidence to gauge her interest. Evelyn's response was immediate and intense. She recognized the story's potential, not just as a tale of personal injustice, but as an exposé of systemic entitlement and abuse. She agreed to assist, under strict confidentiality, helping Malcolm prepare the documentation and plan a strategic release that would maximize impact while minimizing risk to him personally. Meanwhile, Bernard's attacks intensified. He leveraged social media, spreading rumors about Malcolm's competence. He threatened lawsuits, bribed witnesses, and attempted to manipulate HOA board members. Each act of aggression was met with Malcolm's quiet observation, noting patterns, inconsistencies, and the psychological toll Bernard's tactics had on those around him. Every attempt to destabilize Malcolm was catalogued, every slip a potential foothold for the coming plan. The tension reached a crescendo when Bernard attempted direct sabotage. He arranged a high-profile inspection of the estate's security protocols, publicly criticizing Malcolm's work and threatening termination. The HOA, fearful of legal repercussions, nearly suspended him. Malcolm stood before the board, outwardly composed but internally tense, knowing that one wrong word could undo months of planning. Yet he maintained his ground, providing precise documentation and calm explanations that neutralized Bernard's accusations. The room was filled with awkward silence, the power dynamics subtly shifting as the board recognized Malcolm's competence and Bernard's overreach. By this point, Malcolm's plan had begun to crystallize. He would not act recklessly. His approach would be methodical: build irrefutable evidence, cultivate credible allies, and expose Bernard's behavior in a way that could not be dismissed. Every detail had been accounted for: financial records, witness statements, video footage, and the psychological profile of Bernard's predictable arrogance. The final piece fell into place when Malcolm realized that Bernard's overconfidence was his greatest weakness. His need to control every narrative, to micromanage every perception, meant that he was blind to subtle manipulations. Small, deliberate leaks of evidence, carefully timed, could provoke Bernard into overreacting, revealing even more misconduct. Malcolm's approach was psychological as much as procedural: provoke, observe, document, and exploit. One night, after reviewing security footage, invoices, and interview notes, Malcolm sat back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his features. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the climax: Bernard exposed, his influence diminished, justice quietly restored. But Malcolm knew the path there would be fraught with danger. One misstep could ruin him, could allow Bernard to retaliate with devastating consequences. Yet there was no turning back. He had already endured the humiliation, the threats, and the isolation. He had built the foundation of a plan that could finally shift the balance of power. Malcolm's resolve was now unbreakable. The stakes had never been higher. The system that Bernard wielded, wealth, influence, legal threats, was formidable. But Malcolm had something Bernard could never buy: patience, integrity, and a deep understanding of human psychology. The chessboard was set, and the pieces were in motion.
The morning after the HOA meeting, Bernard Lockridge awoke with the same arrogance that had carried him through decades of power. He sipped his espresso in his marble kitchen, scrolling through carefully curated social media feeds, reassured by the smiling images of himself and the gala's highlight reel. The pool incident with Malcolm was now barely a footnote, spun in Bernard's favor by his PR team. He chuckled, thinking himself untouchable. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one Bernard could not yet perceive. Malcolm Reed, quietly and meticulously, had begun to set his plan into motion. Weeks of gathering evidence, studying patterns, and securing allies had coalesced into a precise strategy aimed at dismantling Bernard's carefully constructed world. It began with subtle provocations. Malcolm reached out to Evelyn Tran, the investigative journalist, with a carefully curated package: full-length gala footage, invoices showing financial discrepancies, testimonies from staff who had witnessed Bernard's abuses, and copies of HOA communications that revealed his pattern of intimidation. Evelyn knew the gravity of the material. She would run the story on multiple platforms, ensuring it could not be ignored. Malcolm also made quiet contact with former business associates of Bernard, people who had quietly suffered losses under his aggressive, often illegal, tactics. Their stories, corroborated with documentation, added a layer of legal and moral weight to the exposé. Bernard's reach, formidable as it was, could not contain the truth once it began to circulate externally. By the middle of the week, small tremors appeared in Bernard's world. A former accountant, previously loyal to him, suddenly refused to approve a falsified expense report. One of his staff quietly provided statements to Evelyn, documenting harassment and intimidation. A social media influencer who had attended the gala uploaded a full, unedited clip of the pool incident, showing Bernard's shove in stark, undeniable clarity. Bernard noticed these signs, but only superficially. In his mind, these were minor inconveniences, easily managed by charm, threats, and legal intimidation. But Malcolm had anticipated Bernard's overconfidence. Each minor event was part of a larger strategy designed to provoke predictable mistakes. Bernard's need to control the narrative became his greatest vulnerability. The first major escalation occurred during a live charity event, one Bernard had spent months organizing to showcase his wealth and influence. Malcolm, armed with insider knowledge, coordinated a discreet intervention. Staff were instructed to provide Evelyn with access to the venue, and she quietly set up a live recording that captured Bernard's interactions with donors, volunteers, and VIP guests. When Bernard began his customary rounds, lecturing staff and berating minor errors, the live feed captured everything. Every arrogant word, every dismissive gesture, every public humiliation he inflicted was broadcast online within hours. The viral clip spread like wildfire. Comments poured in, some mocking, some outraged, some pointing to the hypocrisy and cruelty of a man who had previously cultivated a reputation as a philanthropist. Bernard's carefully curated image began to unravel in real time. But Malcolm's plan went deeper. Financial discrepancies identified earlier were now being quietly investigated by regulatory authorities, tipped off by Evelyn with documentation too solid to ignore. Bernard, previously untouchable, was now facing inquiries that could result in severe legal consequences. The first signs of panic appeared. He called frantic meetings with his lawyers, demanding that the investigations be stalled, only to realize that evidence had been meticulously preserved and could not be contested. As Bernard's empire began to wobble, Malcolm remained in the shadows, orchestrating each step with precision. The psychological pressure on Bernard grew exponentially. Staff who had once feared him began to see cracks in his authority. Board members of the HOA, initially hesitant, started questioning his behavior and his influence over community affairs. Former allies withdrew support, unwilling to risk association with a man now publicly exposed as corrupt and cruel. The next critical move occurred at Bernard's estate. Malcolm coordinated a gathering under the pretext of a routine HOA inspection, ensuring that all surveillance cameras and evidence points were operational. Bernard, consumed by the need to reassert dominance, fell into the trap. He attempted to intimidate Malcolm once again, publicly chastising him and asserting his supposed authority. But this time the response was different. Every word, every action was documented, streamed, and recorded. When Bernard shoved Malcolm in a final display of arrogance, it was captured again, this time in the context of his escalating pattern of abuse, already corroborated by multiple witnesses and evidence points. The act that once symbolized Bernard's power now became the centerpiece of his undoing. Authorities, prompted by the accumulated evidence, arrived at the scene shortly after the incident. Bernard's attempts to evade responsibility were met with legal scrutiny. Public outrage erupted online, fueled by the meticulously compiled documentation of his behavior. Bernard, who had once wielded influence like a weapon, was now confronted by forces beyond his control: law, media, and the collective moral judgment of the community. In a private moment, Bernard confronted Malcolm one last time at the estate's edge, the infinity pool reflecting a distorted version of his grandeur. His voice, once commanding, now trembled with fear and desperation. "You can't do this. I built this empire. You don't understand what's at stake." Malcolm, calm but firm, replied, "I understand perfectly. What's at stake is accountability. What's at stake is fairness, and for once, the rules apply to you." Bernard's collapse was not immediate but inevitable. His financial accounts were frozen pending investigation. His social circle turned against him, withdrawing support as public outrage mounted. The HOA enacted policies to limit his influence, and the media coverage ensured that his reputation, once untouchable, was irrevocably tarnished. He became the subject of scrutiny, not the wielder of it. The climax of Malcolm's plan came during a press conference orchestrated by Evelyn, with Malcolm present but unassuming. Evidence was presented clearly: video footage, witness testimony, and documentation of financial and social misconduct. Bernard attempted to deflect, but the case was airtight. For the first time in decades, he was forced to answer publicly for his actions. The power reversal was complete. As Bernard stood in front of reporters, desperate and pleading, Malcolm watched quietly from the sidelines. There was no gloating, no triumphalism, just a steady, calm satisfaction that justice, however long delayed, had been realized. Bernard's empire of fear, manipulation, and arrogance had crumbled, replaced by accountability and transparency. Malcolm's plan had succeeded because he had combined patience, intelligence, and moral clarity with precise timing and strategic insight. Every small step had been calculated to ensure that Bernard's own flaws, arrogance, entitlement, and a need for control became the mechanisms of his undoing. The psychological tension, the high-stakes maneuvers, and the accumulation of evidence had created a scenario in which Bernard's downfall was not only inevitable but undeniable. As the press conference concluded, Bernard's eyes met Malcolm's one final time. There was no hatred, only the hollow expression of a man who had realized that power, when wielded without ethics, is ultimately fragile. Do you feel this was true justice, or was it revenge? Tell me in the comments. In the weeks following Bernard Lockridge's public downfall, Crestview Estates was quieter than it had been in decades. The manicured lawns and sparkling pools remained, but the invisible tension that had always lurked beneath the perfection had shifted. No longer did a single man's ego dictate the rhythm of the community. The gates, once a theater of intimidation, became a symbol of fairness and accountability, watched over by a man who had proved that principle could outlast wealth. Malcolm Reed returned to his post at the estate's gate, his presence calm and measured as ever. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. He greeted guests with the same polite professionalism, checked credentials with the same diligence, and maintained his posture of quiet authority. But behind the eyes that had weathered decades of injustice, there was a deep sense of fulfillment. The moral arc of his long struggle had bent toward justice, and he had been the instrument of its fulfillment. The legal consequences for Bernard were swift and uncompromising. Investigations uncovered multiple violations: financial mismanagement, intimidation of staff and HOA members, and breaches of contract tied to charitable donations. Lawsuits mounted as former business partners and employees came forward, emboldened by Malcolm's quiet campaign to bring truth into the open. The courts froze assets, removed him from leadership positions, and imposed penalties that ensured Bernard would no longer wield his fortune as a weapon of fear. Public reaction was intense. Social media buzzed with commentary about the fall of one of Crestview's most notorious figures. Articles dissected Bernard's rise and precipitous fall, highlighting the dangers of unchecked privilege and the consequences of arrogance. Interviews with guests at the gala, former employees, and community members painted a picture of a man who had long believed himself untouchable, only to be humbled by patience, strategy, and moral clarity. The narrative was no longer about his wealth or charisma. It was about his failures, his cruelty, and his accountability. Amid the public scrutiny, Bernard became increasingly isolated. Friends who had once courted him for influence and access now distanced themselves. Staff who had feared his wrath were no longer compelled to comply. Even family members who had once turned a blind eye to his behavior began to confront the consequences of their association with him. The man who had once commanded admiration and envy was reduced to a figure of cautionary fascination, a symbol of what unchecked arrogance could bring. Malcolm, however, did not revel in Bernard's humiliation. There was no gloating, no delight in the personal suffering of a man who had caused him such pain. Instead, he focused on the broader effects of the work he had done. The community felt safer, more equitable. The HOA implemented reforms, ensuring that no single resident could manipulate the rules to their advantage again. Staff members were reassured that their voices mattered, and new systems were put in place to prevent abuse of power. Malcolm had not just defended himself, he had strengthened the moral fabric of Crestview Estates. In the quiet moments, Malcolm reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of his younger self, delivering packages in pouring rain, working multiple jobs and learning lessons about fairness and integrity. He thought of the humiliation he had endured at Bernard's hands, the threats, the isolation, the constant pressure to conform or break. And he realized that those experiences had forged him into the person capable of orchestrating such a precise, ethical victory. His strength had been drawn not from wealth or influence, but from principle and perseverance. The ripple effects extended beyond the gates. Evelyn Tran's investigative report became a widely cited case study in ethical journalism and community accountability. Universities and public forums referenced it as an example of how one individual, acting with integrity and strategy, could challenge entrenched power structures. Malcolm's story inspired others in similar positions of vulnerability to act, not recklessly but thoughtfully, methodically, and ethically. Even Bernard's attempts to salvage his reputation were futile. Interviews were strained, explanations fell flat, and legal constraints prevented him from exerting the influence he once had. His social circle had shifted irreversibly. Former allies, wary of association with scandal, distanced themselves. Bernard became a cautionary tale, a man who had been pushed not by random chance but by the patient, intelligent application of justice. The irony that the very arrogance which had defined his life had led to his undoing was not lost on anyone, least of all him. Malcolm, meanwhile, continued to live his life quietly. He received recognition from the community, not for heroism or bravado but for steadfast dedication to principle. He became a mentor to younger staff and security personnel, teaching them the importance of integrity, observation, and moral courage. Guests at the estate often remarked on his calm professionalism, unaware of the battles he had waged behind the scenes, and Malcolm preferred it that way. His satisfaction came from knowing that the work had been done, the balance restored, and fairness preserved. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Malcolm walked past the infinity pool at Bernard's estate. Its lights reflected off the water, the same pool that had once been a stage for humiliation. He paused for a moment, considering the journey from that day to this. The man who had shoved him, who had laughed at his discomfort, who had believed that wealth could erase accountability, was now a figure of public scrutiny, restrained by the very systems he had sought to manipulate. Malcolm allowed himself a small, quiet smile, not of triumph over Bernard, but of satisfaction in the restoration of justice. Malcolm knew the struggle against corruption and abuse of power was ongoing. There would always be others who believed money and influence could absolve them from responsibility. But he also knew that strategy, patience, and moral clarity were powerful tools that could turn even the most formidable adversary into a lesson in accountability. The gates of Crestview Estates continued to swing open and closed, the daily rhythms of life resuming their quiet pace. Malcolm stood watch, steady, vigilant, and principled. The community, now aware that rules applied to everyone equally, moved forward with a renewed sense of fairness. And in that quiet, unassuming way, Malcolm Reed became more than a gatekeeper. He became a symbol of enduring integrity. If you made it this far, I'd love to know, what part of this story hit you the hardest? If you want more powerful, human stories like this, consider subscribing. It truly helps me continue creating these for you.